Canoes overturn on calm stretches. Camps vanish under sudden floods. Storms build fast enough to trap entire parties on narrow banks. The guides who work here the longest have warned newcomers about the heat rising off the river in June, and the way the canyon walls close in without much warning. They mention how the sound bounces off of cliffs and make it hard to track anyone who has drifted too far ahead. By the 1920s, in this particular area, search teams were being sent in more than anyone expected. Some missing travelers were found months later. Some were found in conditions that raised questions no one could answer. And a few were found in the state that gives this place its most unsettling name. This is the valley known for the men who were discovered without their heads.
Welcome to Down the Crooked Path. I'm your host, Amanda Joy. Join me as we dive into eerie and spine-chilling stories that blur the lines between reality and the unknown. From cryptids and mysterious disappearances to true crime, UFO sightings, and paranormal activity. Venture into the unknown and uncover the secrets that lie down the crooked path.
When news of gold near Dawson City broke in 1897, the response was intense, to say the least. Close to 100,000 people set out during the gold rush of 1897 and 1898, boarding ships in ports like Seattle and San Francisco and pushing towards the interior. They came from all across North America and beyond, most of them men of Euro-American descent with little real experience in northern travel, winter fright, or, to say the least, prospecting. The trail would strip that number down fast. Many turned back because of illness that set in early on the routes. Others stopped after injuries from falls, failing equipment, or accidents with overloaded packs. Exhaustion ended the journey for entire groups who could not keep up with the demands of the passes and the portages. By the time the flow of people narrowed towards the Yukon River and Dawson City area, only about 30 to 40,000 actually arrived. The ones still moving forward were known at the time as stampeders, a name given to the men and women rushing towards the goldfields. Contagious diseases took more stampeders than anything else during the rush. The White Pass and the Chilkoot routes carried a steady line of these travelers, and those same routes carried illnesses from camp to camp. In 1898, a meningitis outbreak in Skagway spread fast enough that the stampeders died before they ever reached the passes. Violence followed close behind as a cause of death. Skagway grew into a boom town crowded with newcomers who arrived on every steamer, and assaults were common. Sam Steele of the Northwest Mounted Police described the place as little better than hell on earth, and about the roughest place in the world. Typhoid fever was another serious culprit once they actually reached Dawson City. After the long trip up the Yukon River, they entered a boomtown built on swampy grounds with limited sanitation. The water carried the bacteria that caused high fevers, stomach trouble, and a rash, leaving victims weak and drifting in and out of awareness. One Yukon doctor noted that gold rushers often worked long hours and ate whatever required the least amount of time to prepare. Even liquor became a problem. Spirits in Dawson City were so diluted that bacteria grew in the bottles, and by the end of the winter in 1898, bars were serving what one observer called whiskey-flavored water. Before 1903, as many as 60% of the people jailed there were violent offenders, and about 20% of the deaths in that period came from trauma linked in those attacks. Now, the records from 1897 are missing, so the real number is likely higher than what we actually have estimated. Stampeders reaching the border had one more obstacle before they could enter Canada. A line of Northwest Mounted Police waited at the pass, checking every group that came through. The Yukon government had seen too many unprepared travelers collapse in early rushes, so the rules were very strict. Each person had to haul a full year's supply of food and gear, about 2,000 pounds, before being allowed to continue. The requirement wasn't negotiable. Winters around Dawson City were severe, and the region didn't have the resources to support anyone who arrived without enough to survive. In the spring of 1898, the Mounties and local residents worked on Dawson City's water and sewer systems to slow the spread of typhoid fever. The improvements helped keep the outbreak from growing as the summer crowds approached. Once the stampeders finished the Chilkoot or the White Pass trails, they reached Lake Bennett. This was where they bought or built boats for the next stage of the trip. The run from Bennett to Dawson City stretched roughly 550 miles along the Yukon River. Many stampeders had never built a boat before, so the Mounties stepped in again. Every vessel had to be inspected and registered with the Northwest Mounted Police before anyone was allowed to launch. Illness, injury, and exhaustion followed stampeders from the coast all the way to the interior. Every stage of the journey carried its own risks, and even the most prepared travelers found themselves dealing with problems that they would never planned for. Trails washed out, boats failed, and weather turned routes into dead ends. The North had no shortage of ways to stop a person in their tracks, but there was one stretch of the country that stood apart from everything else people crossed during those years. No place carried a reputation as dangerous or as mysterious as the Nahanni Valley. There is a stretch of country in the far north that has pulled people in for generations. Adventurers, prospectors, and travelers made their way towards it long before the gold rush crowd arrived, each drawn in by stories of remote land and the possibility of something valuable hidden at its core. What they found instead were disappearances, unexplained deaths, and remains that raised far more questions than answers. Over time, the place gained a reputation that spread far beyond the Northwest Territory, a name that reflects the men who were found without their heads. It's called the Valley of the Headless Men. Deep in the Northwest Territories, about 500 kilometers from Yellowknife, the valley sits in a region that remains difficult to reach. It is the part of protected area managed by Parks Niagara, but the designation doesn't make it any easier to access. No roads lead in. The visitors arrive by private float plane, and only a few hundred people manage the trip each year. The isolation, the distance, and the terrain keep the valley largely untouched, even as interest in it continues to grow. For the Dene people, this land is tied to generations of history. The area overlaps with traditional territories of 7 indigenous communities, including the Decho First Nations. The name Nahanni comes from the Dene and refers to the river connected to the land of the Naha people. Their presence in this region long predates the prospectors who later tried to cross it, and their knowledge of the valley remains central to its story. The Dene continue to travel these waterways and move through this land for harvesting, cultural practices, and ceremonies. The connection runs through generations, and the relationship of the valley remains intact. In 2022, an agreement set out to a shared governance approach between the Indigenous communities and the Canadian government, reinforcing their role in decisions tied to the park. The valley's distance from major settlements has kept its wildlife largely undisturbed. Mountain goats move across steep rock faces, and dolly sheep graze in the higher meadows. Predators leave a strong impression on anyone who enters. Grizzly bears travel through the low areas, and timber wolves move in packs across the ridges and canyons. Bald eagles circle above the river, and beavers work along the waterways, shaping the channel with their dams. When Europeans pushed into the region, their arrival folded into the long history already tied to this stretch of the north. The Hudson Bay Company set up along the Mackenzie River in the 18th and 19th centuries, turning the waterway into a major route for the fur trade. Indigenous trappers kept the trade moving, and the river carried those furs out of the wilderness and into markets far from where they were taken. For a long time, that network was the main link between those remote camps and the rest of the continent. By the late 1800s, prospectors showed up from everywhere, convinced that they were one strike away from changing their lives. Some managed it. Others walked straight into the terrain they didn't understand and never came back. Trails went cold, camps were left behind. Stories followed the stampeders just as quickly as the rumors of gold. And a lot of those stories ended up with someone disappearing into the wilderness without a trace. The first disappearance in the valley happened back in 1898, when 6 prospectors packed their gear, grabbed their rifles, and headed in looking for gold. When they didn't come back, nobody panicked. People go missing in the wilderness all the time. It wasn't until years later that anyone stumbled across the truth. A hunter moving through the valley found an old campsite and several skeletons scattered around. Authorities identified them as the missing prospectors. The official line was exposure, which was common enough in the region, but the scene didn't match the simplicity of that explanation. The bodies were found with their heads missing, and the skeletons were still positioned with rifles in their hands. One account mentioned the skulls sitting nearby the remains, but the RCMP chalked it up to scavenging animals. The whole thing barely made the news. A short note in a Yukon paper mentioned the discovery without even naming the men, and that was it. The story would have disappeared like so many others if it were not for what came next. In the early 1900s, three brothers from Fort Laird named Willie, Frank, and Charlie McLeod decided that they were going to go looking for gold in the Nahanni Valley. They figured that since so few people had ever made it inside the valley, any gold sitting there probably hadn't been touched. They gathered what they needed, used sled dogs and homemade boats to get through the long trip in, and eventually reached the Flat River, which cuts through the middle of the valley. Now, the name makes it sound calm, but the river actually has sections that behave more like rapids. Now, their first trip into the valley wasn't a full mining operation. They treated it more like a scouting trip. They carried what they could, followed the river, and tried to figure out where the old stories about gold might have started. They didn't find anything on that first run, but they learned how the river moved and what the terrain demanded from anyone trying to work there. They went back for a second attempt, and this time they pushed further than before. When they reached a spot along the Flat River, they set up camp and put their sluice boxes into the water. A sluice box is a long wooden box with a strainer on one end. Miners shove riverbed sediment into it, and the water washes away the lighter material, leaving heavier pieces, like gold, behind. According to later accounts, the brothers started finding gold almost immediately. They kept at it day and night until their containers were full. With that early success, they decided to head out, stake a claim, and return with more men and better equipment. They packed up their camp and loaded everything into their boat and started down the Flat River. However, early in that trip, the boat hit trouble in the section known as the Cascade of the 13 Steps. The rapids damaged the boat and it broke apart. Most of their supplies and nearly all the gold went under. They managed to pull a rifle and a few pieces of lumber to the shore. They were frustrated, but still alive. And they had one sluice. They decided to try and go back to their original spot and recover at least some gold before leaving the valley. They built another boat from the lumber that they salvaged and from trees they cut down. They went back upriver to the same place where they had found the gold before. This time, the sluice didn't give them anything. After losing their supplies, losing their gold, and now failing to recover even a small amount from the same location, they went to sleep that night, worn out and done with the whole situation. The next morning, they packed up again, got back into the Flat River, and they made their way out of the valley. In 1905, Willie and Frank McLeod decided that they were headed back into the Nahanni Valley. They had already proven to themselves that gold existed in there, and they wanted another shot at bringing out enough to fund a larger operation. Charlie, the oldest brother, wasn't interested in repeating the close call that they had had with the capsized boat, so he stayed home. Willie and Frank found a third man named Robert Weir, a Scottish engineer who had plenty of experience traveling through remote areas. The three of them spent the winter getting ready for the long stay in the valley, planning to bring back as much gold as they could carry. When spring arrived, they set out with their supplies and pack horses and followed the water west towards the valley. Their departure didn't really draw much attention. It was just the three men headed into the wilderness, which was normal for the region. But weeks passed with no word, then months. No messages came downriver that fall, and nothing turned up during the winter. Their silence didn't cause alarm at first because long gaps in communication were common. By the second winter, even the trappers and traders who knew the area began to wonder what was going on. Now, Charlie, he had been working between Fort Laird and Fort Simpson during this time. He wasn't worried at first because he assumed that the three men had found a strong vein of gold and were staying out longer to gather as much as possible. But when another summer arrived with no sign of them, he decided he needed to go into the valley himself. He gathered 4 men from his community, along with Dene guides who knew the upper river, and prepared for the long trip in. The old trail into the valley had faded after years of flooding and regrowth, but the Dene guides with Charlie's group still knew enough of the route to get them moving towards the upper gorge. The search party followed the Flat River, staying with the rapids and checking both banks for any sign of Willie, Frank, or Robert Weir. They kept going until they reached the point where the Flat River branches away from the South Nahanni River. The turn there is sharp, and the group followed it towards the main waterway that leads deeper into the valley. By 1907, 2 full years had passed since the 3 men had left, and Charlie continued up the river of the South Nahanni Junction, moving through the first canyon and then into the second canyon, where the cliffs rose high above the water. He stayed on that route, heading further into the valley in hopes of finding the men. The point where Flat River meets the South Nahanni is known as the Big Bend. It is a sharp turn, about 45 degrees, and once you follow it, you are immediately pushed into a 10-mile stretch called the Second Canyon. The South Nahanni River runs roughly 350 miles, and along that distance, it cuts through 4 major canyons. Each one has sheer rock walls that rise about 3,000 feet high, and in some places, the water below is just as deep. The second canyon is unique because the cliffs sit almost directly against the river. There's barely any shoreline on either side, so once you enter that 10-mile section, you're boxed in. You have deep water under you, vertical rock beside you, and no real place to stop until you reach the far end. High up on the cliff faces are openings that lead into large cave systems inside the rock. The entrances are scattered across both sides of the canyon, but the height and the difficulty of reaching them have kept them unexplored. To say that this area is probably the most dangerous on the river is an understatement, and when Charlie and the search party moved into the second canyon, the light dropped immediately because the cliffs blocked out the sun. The wind picked up inside the canyon, and as they traveled through the 10-mile stretch, they checked the narrow strips of the shoreline whenever one appeared. They were hoping for any sign of Willie or Frank or even Robert Weir, but nothing showed up. As Charlie's search party moved out of the second canyon and towards the wider stretch near the first canyon, the shoreline finally opened up enough to land the boat. On the left side, tucked between trees, they saw a tent. They went straight to it, and once they were close enough, they saw a body on the ground in front of the tent. The head was gone. The clothing on the body was burned in different places, and the right arm was stretched towards a rifle leaning against the tree. Behind the tent, half inside and half outside the opening, they found a second body. This one was also missing its head. They searched the area for a third body and for the heads, but found neither. When they checked the pockets of the first body and looked inside the tent, they found personal items that confirmed the 2 dead men were Willie and Frank. Robert Weir was not at the campsite. Months later, a partial skeleton was found further down the river and was attributed to him, although never properly confirmed. Near the campsite, carved into a tree, they found a message that read, "We have found a fine prospect." It suggested that the men had located gold, but there was no gold at the campsite. No sluices. Nothing that explained what happened. So Charlie contacted the RCMP, and the officers traveled to the campsite. Their conclusion was that the men had died from starvation and that animals had taken the head. Charlie rejected that explanation. He believed his brothers had been killed, possibly by Weir, who he suspected might have taken the gold and fled. Needless to say, the story spread quickly. People compared it to the earlier case of the 6 prospectors who had been found without their heads. Others speculated that Weir had murdered the brothers and escaped with the gold. Some repeated older stories about the valley and claimed the deaths were connected to something dangerous in the region. Theories circulated about attacks missing gold and the possibility of an unknown animal in the area. Fear around the valley grew, and that section of the second canyon where the bodies were found became known as the Valley of the Headless Men. Prospectors stayed away for a time until a Swiss miner named Martin Jorgensen decided he was going in it anyways. He planned to live in the valley long-term and search for gold on his own. In 1917, Martin had set up a small cabin along the Flat River, not far from where the McLeod brothers had made their final camp. He planned to stay throughout the winter and meet his business partners in Yellowknife the following summer. Before settling in, he traveled downriver and sent word that he had struck gold, so his partners were expecting him to return with a strong claim. Summer arrived, and Martin didn't. Nearly 2 months with no sign of him, his partners hired a guide and went into the valley. They reached the area where he was supposed to be staying and found what was left of his cabin. It had burned to the ground. Near the remains of the structure lay a body, burned and missing its head. A rifle was found in the ashes, still cocked. The police investigated but could not determine how he died. They did not connect his death to the McLeod brothers, even though the circumstances were nearly identical, and no gold was found at the site. This story also spread quickly, and people compared Martin's death to the earlier incident and pointed out the glaring similarities. Authorities, though, insisted that the cases were unrelated and repeated the explanation that animals had taken the head. In 1921, a trapper named John O'Brien was found dead in the Nahanni Valley, just a few miles upstream from that area that had already gained a reputation because of those earlier cases. O'Brien was an experienced woodsman who knew how to handle the cold, which made the way he was found extremely strange. He was seated in front of a campfire that had burned out. His posture looked relaxed, and he still had the matchbook in his hand, as if he had been about to light another fire. There was nothing on his face that suggested panic or pain. The people who saw the scene said that it looked like he had frozen in place in a very short amount of time. For someone with his level of experience, the position of his body didn't match what usually happens when a person freezes to death in the wilderness. Even with these strange details, the authorities ruled that he had in fact died from exposure, and they didn't open a larger investigation, and no further explanation was offered. In 1926, a hunting party headed into the Nahanni Valley. The group included Poole and Mary Field, several hunters from Fort Simpson, and Mary's younger cousin, Annie Lafferty. People who knew Annie described her as strange, and one member of the party actually called her neurotic. The group was traveling through the area that would later be known as Mary's River, a branch that flows into the South Nahanni through the Third Canyon. One morning, Annie was gone. At first, no one reacted strongly because it seemed reasonable to assume that she had stepped into the bush and would just later return. As the day went on, and she didn't come back, Mary grew worried. Poole gathered 5 experienced hunters, Diamond C., Boston Jack, Charlie Johan, George Taso, and Big Charlie, and they went into the forest to track her. The hunters right away picked up her trail, and at first it looked like she had simply wandered off, but then the tracks started to tell a different story. Her moccasin prints showed that she had started moving quickly, cutting through the brush in a way that made the men work hard to keep up with her. As they followed her path, they found pieces of her clothing hanging on branches. The fabric had been torn and the pieces were scattered at irregular intervals. It looked as though she had removed her clothing as she ran. Despite the heat, the insects, and the terrain, her trail kept climbing onto the mountain. The hunters followed it for 9 days. They continued for 4 more before they finally had to stop. Annie was never found. Months later, after the group returned home and the story reached the newspapers, a hunter known only as Charlie went to the police. He said that while he had been camping near the Third Canyon, he woke up in the middle of the night to the sound of rocks falling into the river. In the moonlight, he saw a naked girl on all 4s climbing the cliff. He said that she moved like an animal, stopping occasionally to look around before continuing up the rock face. He described her expression as a fixed grin with wide eyes. He had dismissed the sight as a dream until he read about Annie's disappearance and realized that the timing and the location matched where he had been. Of course, the police didn't investigate his account. They said that no one could survive in the mountains without clothes, and Annie was presumed dead. The creek where she disappeared was later named Mays Creek in her memory. In 1927, Yukon Fisher was a part-time prospector and an outlaw who had spent years hiding in the wilderness of the Northwest Territories. He had originally come north as a stampeder, taking the Ashford Trail into the Klondike, a route known for being long and miserable. At some point in a Yukon salon, he had gotten into an argument with a bartender and struck him with a bottle. According to prospector Billy Clark, Fisher was convinced that he had killed the man, and so he left the settlement and disappeared into the bush. From that point on, Fisher lived in isolation. He avoided both indigenous communities and other prospectors, staying deep in the backcountry and only coming out occasionally to trade for essentials like salt, tea, ammunition, and matches. Poole Field, who saw him more than most, said that Fisher had developed senses sharp enough to tell the difference between a moose, a caribou, a deer, or a person just by the sound of their steps in the brush. Field also described him as a huge man, wrapped in furs, who moved through the wilderness with absolute ease. It was in 1927 that Fisher fled into the Nahanni Valley while the RCMP were pursuing him for crimes committed in the Yukon. He set up a camp near the same stretch of the valley where the McLeod brothers had been found years earlier. When the RCMP eventually reached his campsite, they found that the shelter had been burned to the ground. Fisher's body was nearby, decapitated. His rifle had been warped by the heat of the fire. In the weeks before his death, he had been spending gold quite freely, but no one ever determined where the gold had actually come from. In 1929, 3 prospectors, Angus Hall, J.M. Gilroy, and Andy Hay, all set out for the Nahanni Valley in search of gold. They chose an unusual route, boating from Fort Nelson towards the Laird River and then into the South Nahanni. By May, they had reached the river, but a series of flash floods and mechanical problems had slowed them down. They managed to push past the second canyon and reached the mouth of Scow Creek before their motor finally failed. With the boat no longer usable, the men paddled to shore and continued on foot. They set up camp near Bennett Creek, but the tensions rose almost instantly. Hall, known for having a short temper, got into an argument with the others and walked off into the forest. Gilroy and Hay didn't think much of it at first. They were used to Hall's temper and expected him to return once he cooled down. Later that day, they even saw him climbing further into the nearby valley, which reassured them. When night came and Hall still hadn't returned, they began to worry. By morning, their concern grew. They followed Bennett Creek upstream, trying to trace the direction that he had taken. The only sign they found was a single hop-nailed boot print in the mud, the same type that Hall wore, but beyond that, there was nothing. Gilroy and Hay eventually crossed paths with another group of prospectors in the area. Fred Hessler, Bill Hill, W. Cochran, and George Spangler. After sharing a meal, the two joined forces and searched the surrounding valleys, bed creeks, and forests for several days. They found no clothing, no equipment, no tracks, and no sign of Hall. August Hall was never found. The lone footprint is the only trace of him that ever turned up in the Nahanni Valley. It's 1931, and Phil Powers is a trapper from Fort Nelson, who is known as a tough and reliable frontiersman who understands the wilderness. Powers built a cabin at the mouth of Irvine Creek, across the Flat River from old Pot Hot Springs, and set up a trap line in the area. Months later, when Powers failed to return, searchers followed his line upriver. The first sign that something was wrong came when they found several lynx and fox skeletons still caught in traps that had been set but never checked. Further along, near the union of the Caribou and Flat Rivers, they found the remains of his 22-foot canoe. When they reached Irvine Creek and continued on foot, they found what was left of his cabin. Like others in this area, the cabin had burned to the ground, and the ashes were the fire-blackened bones of Phil Powers. Now accounts differ on the conditions of the remains. Some say that the skeleton was headless and that a 6-shooter was still in his hand. Others say that the skull was found at his feet. The RCMP investigated and concluded that a faulty stovepipe was the cause of the fire. But the prospectors who knew Powers, they disagreed. They pointed out that he was experienced and he would have built the cabin so that the stovepipe cleared the roof timbers. They also noted that if the fire had started on the roof would have collapsed and the poles and the dirt would have fallen inwards, smothering the flames, leaving more of the structure intact. Instead, the fire had burned so hot that only the bottom logs remained, along with a small portion of bones. Another peculiar detail: Powers' cash was untouched, except for the cans of gasoline he used for his powerboat. Those were empty. Some prospectors suggested that someone could have shot Powers through the window while he was on his bunk and then used the gasoline to burn the cabin. But no further explanation was ever confirmed. In late 1935, bush pilot George C. F. Dizelle flew two trappers, Joe McLeod and Bill Epler, into the Nahanni Valley. He dropped them off at Britnell Lake, a remote body of water sitting beneath the cliffs known as the Surt of the Unclimbables. The men planned to spend the winter trapping and had brought several yards of canvas to build a skin boat for hauling their furs down the South Nahanni River in the spring. When spring arrived and the two men failed to return, McLeod's brother Jack raised the alarm. After speaking with Epler's associates, a search party was organized and Dazelle flew everyone back into the valley. Near the spot where he had originally dropped off the men, the group found the first signs that something had gone wrong. The remains of a cabin that had been burned to the ground. This matches the pattern seen in earlier cases of Jorgensen and Powers. There are no bodies, no clothing, and no equipment, nothing indicating where the two men had gone. Searches continued throughout the area, but nothing else was found. But then, in May of 1936, a group of hunters who had been camped at Irvine Creek, waiting for the ice to break, traveled down to the mouth of Flat River. At the base of Direction Mountain, they found the remains of a campfire that was only a few days old. As they continued down the South Nahanni, they saw several trees that had been cut with an axe. Since McLeod and Epler were the only ones known to be in the valley at the time, the campfire and the felled trees are assumed to be their last traces.
Looking for your next obsession? The Creators Collective Podcasts is your gateway to the dark, the chilling, and the downright fascinating. We're a community of independent podcasts with one goal: to share the best in true crime, paranormal tales, folklore, and unexplained mysteries. Whether you crave cold cases that won't stay closed, haunted histories that refuse to be forgotten, or stories that make you sleep with the lights on, there's a show waiting for you in the collective. And when you join us, you're not just listening to one podcast. You're stepping into a world of creators who love this stuff as much as you do. Check out the Creators Collective today. Follow the link in our show notes to discover your next favorite podcast. We'll be waiting for you.
The following winter, two hunters, Al Lewis and Harry Vandell, entered the valley and found something even stranger near Rabbit Kettle Lake at the northern end of the Nahanni. They came across a series of small camps, each one consisting of neatly folded tarps with various items placed on top. Some held empty tobacco tins. One held a wolf's leg. The caches were spaced miles apart and arranged in a way that neither man recognized. Lewis later said that the trappers and prospectors didn't leave tarps behind at random spots, which made the discovery even more unusual. No further evidence of McLeod or Epler were ever found. Their burned cabin, the campfire remains, the axe-cut trees, and the scattered tarp catches were the only clues left behind. Two men became yet another pair who vanished into the Nahanni Valley. In 1940, the Edmonton Journal reported an aeronautical engineer named William Gilbertson had been found dead in his cabin somewhere in the Nahanni Valley. Very little was recorded about him, and even less about the circumstances of his death. No official explanation was ever published. That same year, a frontiersman named Ollie Holmberg disappeared in the valley. He left no trace, and no details about his disappearance were ever confirmed. 5 years later, prospector Walter J. Tully entered the Nahanni Valley with two partners. Their expedition ended almost immediately. They came across a badly decomposed body at the banks of Flat River. The man was laying inside a sleeping bag, and his head, of course, had been severed. The RCMP identified the remains as those of Ernest Savard, a 40-year-old French-Canadian prospector known throughout the northern trading posts. As for the cause of death, investigators suggested that Ernest had grown weak from hunger, crawled into his sleeping bag, and simply died. They claimed that animals had been unable to reach the rest of his body and instead gnawed at his head. No further explanation was given, like so many other cases in the Nahanni. In the autumn of 1946, a prospector named Frank Henderson came out of the Nahanni Valley with a poke containing 30 ounces of gold and a story that clearly shook him. Henderson was the nephew of Robert Henderson, one of the three co-discoverers of the gold that launched the Klondike Gold Rush, and he had spent most of his life in the northern wilderness working on claims. Despite that experience, he was visibly rattled when he described what happened in the Nahanni to journalist George Murray at Fort St. John. That fall, Henderson explained that he had planned to prospect with his longtime partner, John Patterson, at Watson Lake, Yukon, near the Laird River, northwest of Lower Post, BC. Patterson was another seasoned backcountryman, well known among traders in Vancouver and Calgary, and was said to have served as an advisor on the Alaska Highway. The plan was to meet at Virginia Fall in the spring of 1946 and then travel together to Watson Lake. Henderson approached from the Northwest Territory side by dog sled, accompanied by 5 First Nation guides. Patterson was coming from the east by way of the Mackenzie River. As usual, the two men formed a system of messages carved into trees and agreed upon spots to keep track of each other's movements. Henderson reached the meeting point first. When Patterson didn't arrive on time, Henderson carved his message into the tree and moved on to the valley, assuming Patterson was delayed and that they would meet up further along the route. On their first night in the valley, Henderson was jolted awake by a strange wailing sound. The party had made camp on a rock outcrop about half a mile above the valley, and the sound seemed to be coming from the riverbed below. His guides were already awake and clearly frightened. They motioned for him to stay low and silent. They had already put out the fire and covered the fireplace with a pot. The wailing went on for hours. When it finally stopped, Henderson pressed them for an explanation. All he could get from them was that they had seen white giants by the river. He later said that whatever was the source, the sounds were unlike anything he had ever heard from any animal or person. The guides at this point refused to continue down the South Nahanni River. Instead, they detoured east, both to get out of the valley and to try and intercept Patterson on the route he was expected to take. Along that path, Henderson found one of Patterson's carved messages into a tree, confirming that Patterson had in fact entered the Nahanni. Henderson wanted to turn back into the valley and look for him, but his guides refused to re-enter the area. When Patterson failed to meet them anywhere along the way to Laird River and still hadn't appeared by August, Henderson decided that he had to go back into the Nahanni to search for him. His guides still refused to enter, so he went alone. He spent the rest of the season in the valley searching for his partner. He later said that all summer he moved with extreme caution, mostly at night. He never again encountered the white figures that had terrified his guides, and he never found any trace of Patterson. Patterson's body was never recovered, and no clues surfaced to explain what had happened to him. Author Pierre Breton later wrote that Henderson, a man who might have had a good reason not to encourage more people to rush into the area, was quoted on his return as saying, "There is absolutely no denying the sinister atmosphere of that whole valley." So, what is happening in the so-called Headless Valley of the North? Some people look to the Dene story of the Naha, the warlike indigenous group said to have vanished from the region. Their disappearance is often tied to the valley's violent reputation, with some suggesting that their descendants, or their spirits, remain hidden and protective of their old territory. Others point to the valley's isolation and harsh conditions and suggest that the explanation is human. In that view, rival prospectors, driven by greed and desperation, may have killed to protect claims, eliminated competition, or steal gold. The lawless nature of remote prospecting camps would have made it easy for violence to go unpunished. Skeptics do tend to focus on the human behavior, accidents, exposure, and even scavenging animals. But even they acknowledge that the number of deaths, disappearances, and especially the decapitations in and around the valley is difficult to dismiss outright. The pattern has kept the Nahanni's reputation alive. Frank Henderson's experience is often cited as one of the more unsettling modern accounts. He went in with a clear plan, a trusted partner, and experienced indigenous guides. He came out with gold, no partner, no answers, and a story about white giants, and a valley that he describes as having genuine sinister atmosphere. However, most accounts of the so-called Curse of the Nahanni Valley ended with the strange death of a Ukrainian trapper, John Sibak. He was an experienced hunter, yet somehow he starved to death less than a mile upriver from a well-stocked cabin that he did know about. When searchers found him, his body had been badly disturbed by animals. Gus Crass, a guide hired by the RCMP, said that the scene was just a mess, with scraps of clothing and scattered bones. A journal was found nearby. Most of it was ruined by weather, but investigators could still read the final entry. Dated February 3rd, 1946. It stated that it had been 43 days since John had last eaten, a claim that was difficult to reconcile with his skills and the wildlife in the area. But the deaths and the disappearances in the valley didn't stop there. In 1957, a man named Leonard Brunchnick entered the Nahanni in search of the lost McLeod gold mine. Several months later, his body was found on a cut bank shelf along the South Nahanni River, lying face down in dried blood and vomit. In 1962, pilot Angus Blake Mackenzie vanished while flying over the valley. An RCAF search and rescue operation lasted 40 days. No trace of him or his aircraft was ever found. That same year, bush pilot Kenneth Stockwell flew 3 men, Victor Hudden, Gunther Gortez, and Henry Bussey, into the valley for an expedition. Months later, the wreckage of Stockwell's plane was discovered near Virginia Falls, along with the body of Victor, but the remains of the other 3 men were never located. On June 22, 1963, 3 Swiss canoeists set down the South Nahanni River. In early August, a Mountie patrol found one of their bodies trapped beneath the wall of the Figure 8 Rapids. A poncho was wrapped around his head, and the icy water had preserved the remains almost completely. The cause of death, though, could not be determined. He hadn't drowned, and the other 2 men were never found. A new research expedition into the valley was funded by German magazine Spiegel in 1980. The publishing house hired 3 former U.S. airborne troops and tasked them with spending a month in the Valley of the Headless, documenting everything that they encountered. Despite their training and experience, the team ran into trouble instantly. 2 days after their arrival, they sent a radiogram reporting that the valley and they themselves were being enveloped by something like fog. After that message, all communication stopped. The 3 men had disappeared without a trace. A rescue team was sent in after them, and it also vanished. Since 1908, more than 44 recorded deaths and disappearances have been tied to the Nahanni, giving rise to the name the Valley of the Headless Men. Even in recent decades, this pattern hasn't stopped. In 2005, 2 men, Frederick Hardesty and David Horsey, visited a cabin in the North Nahanni River. Both vanished shortly after. Frederick's body was found later in the river, and David's body was discovered several kilometers away in thick bush. The official reports listed drowning and hypothermia as the cause of deaths. Their families questioned that conclusion, pointing to details of the scenes that didn't fit the explanation, including bullet holes in the cabin and other unexplained evidence. These modern cases sit alongside more than a century of earlier incidents: decapitated prospectors, burned cabins, vanished trappers, missing pilots, and entire expeditions that never returned. Theories range from human violence to environmental hazards to supernatural. Some point to the Dene stories of the warlike people who have been said to disappear from the region, suggesting that descendants or spirits might guard the valley. Others focus on the isolation and lawless nature of prospecting, arguing that greed and competition could explain violence. But there's also more speculative ideas. Ice Age survivors, the Wahili, or the notion that the valley hides access to something deeper, some sort of subterranean world. Whatever the explanation, the Nahanni Valley's reputation has never faded. Its remote canyons, unpredictable weather, and long history of unexpected deaths continues to leave an impression that something in the wild has never been fully understood. Some theories about the Nahanni Valley's darker history points towards the land itself. Due to its unusual geographical makeup, the valley escaped the last major glaciation. For at least 100,000 years, the region remained ice-free while the surrounding north was buried under sheets of ice. Over time, all kinds of plants and animals took refuge in the sheltered canyons of the Mackenzie Mountains. Fossils found in the area support that long history. One recent discovery, a sponge-like fossil estimated 890 million years old, has led some researchers to suggest that the Nahanni may hold some of the oldest animal fossils on Earth. Frontier stories and Dene oral accounts take it further. They suggest that descendants of some of these prehistoric animals that once lived in the valley, including unusually large Pleistocene species, may have survived into recent times. Philip Godsell, who wrote extensively about the Nahanni, recorded an account from Frank Worth Beat, a Scotsman who joined the Hudson Bay Company at 17 and later served as chief factor at Fort St. John until 1945. Now, Beaton had overseen several scientific surveys of the region in the early 1900s. One of those survey teams traveled with a Dene guide named Shekinah. Shekinah told them that his father had once journeyed north into the river and encountered a primitive tribe armed with bone-shard javelins and clubs made from moose jawbones. Around their fires, these people spoke of a medicine valley to the north inhabited by monsters of enormous size and ferocity. One of the men from that tribe carried a buckskin in his medicine bag. Burned into it was the image of one of these creatures. Shekinah's father acquired the charm and kept it for years before passing it down to his son. Shekinah showed the buckskin to the scientists, who later told Beaton that the figure was a dinosaur, drawn with precise anatomical details. This idea wasn't entirely dismissed. Dinosaur remains have been found in the Northwest Territories, including specimens recovered from Bear Rock Sinkhole, a formation created by the collapse of a massive underground cave. After the Klondike Gold Rush, many sourdoughs who failed to strike it rich in the Yukon drifted into the Nahanni country. They panned the creeks feeding the South Nahanni and the Flat Rivers, and returned to trading posts with stories of a hidden valley somewhere in the Mackenzie Mountains. According to them, this valley was warm year-round, heated by hundreds of hot springs. Fog hung heavy over it, and the soil was black and fertile. They described lush vegetation and an abundance of game. One prospector claimed that moose, caribou, and sheep mountain were so well fed they looked almost square from fat. Alongside these stories came reports of mammoths, mastodons, and other prehistoric animals said to still roam most remote parts of the region. Both indigenous trappers and white prospectors claimed to have seen fresh tracks in the snow or creek bed clay. Some frontiersmen returned with ivory tusks that still had hair and flesh attached. Rumors circulated that a few hunters had even encountered the animals themselves and survived to talk about it. For just a second, let's touch back on the Naha. According to Dene tradition, the Nahanni Valley was once home to a nomadic warlike tribe known as the Naha. The Naha lived high in the mountains and were feared throughout the region. They were known for descending without warning into the lowlands along Laird and Mackenzie rivers, raiding the Dene settlements and then disappearing back into the high country before anyone could retaliate. After a series of devastating attacks, a group of Dene warriors set out to put an end to the raids. They followed the Naha Trail deep into Nahanni County, eventually coming upon a small encampment of teepees. The Dene prepared to strike, expecting to find raiders inside. But when they rushed the camp, weapons ready, they found nothing. The teepees were intact. The fires, though, were cold. There were no bodies, no tracks, no sign of struggle. It was as if the Naha vanished in an instant. With stories of evil spirits and giant cannibals suddenly at the front of their minds, the Dene warriors abandoned the mission and retreated back into the lowlands. They never returned to the valley, and they never saw the Naha again. As the 1960s rolled in, the Nahanni Valley stopped being the exclusive territory of prospectors and trappers. Word of its untouched canyons and uncharted plateaus began circulating through universities, and suddenly geologists, naturalists, and field researchers were lining up for permits. With the northern frontier shrinking under industrial pressure, the Nahanni was one of the last places left where a scientist could step into a landscape that hadn't been carved up, cataloged, or tamed. But not every academic came back with the kind of data that they had expected. A handful returned with stories that they couldn't fit into a report. Their accounts, paired with older Dene and frontier anecdotes, sparked a new legend, one that didn't involve lost gold or missing prospectors, but something alive. Some believe that the creature could be a relict amphibian, the so-called bear dog, a massive, bone-crushing predator thought to have vanished 8 million years ago. Others pointed out that the Wahili's build and proportions matched the dire wolf, a prehistoric cousin of the timber wolf that once dominated the Pleistocene era. Whatever it was, the idea took hold. A creature that size living alone in a valley with a century of unexplained deaths and disappearances became an easy suspect. And for some, the Wahili isn't just a legend. It's the most logical explanation that anyone has offered. Some of the old sourdoughs had simple explanation for the Nahanni's long list of deaths and disappearances. To them, the pattern wasn't random. It wasn't coincidence. Instead, it was proof of what they had always believed, that the valley was cursed, and that anyone who pushed too far into its canyons in search of gold, or came too close to finding it, paid for it with their life. Looking back at the stories, it's easy to see why that belief held on for so long. Prospectors vanished and camps were found burned. Bodies turned up in places that made absolutely no sense, and some were headless. Some were untouched. Some were never found at all. And the people who went in after them often met the same fate. Maybe the explanation is something simple: human greed. Men pushing into a place that they didn't understand, convinced that they could take whatever they want from it. A place where isolation, weather, and desperation could turn any mistake into a fatal one. But there's another idea that lingers in the background of every Nahanni story. The Dene have said for generations that the valley is watched over by ancient spirits, and that certain parts of it are not meant to be disturbed. Some believe those spirits protect the land from outsiders, especially those who arrive hungry for gold or anything else that the valley might hold. Whether the danger comes from the land itself, from the people who entered it, or from something older that has always lived there, the Nahanni Valley has a way of reminding anyone who steps inside its border that nothing in that wilderness is guaranteed. And for more than a century, the people who tried to claim its riches have learned the same lesson the hard way. This is Amanda Joy. Thank you for joining me down this crooked path. May whatever watches in the dark keep its distance from your way. Follow the path further. If this episode left you lingering in the shadows, there's more to explore. Follow at Down the Crooked Path on TikTok and Instagram for haunting visuals, behind-the-scenes lore, and updates on upcoming episodes. Every post is another breadcrumb deeper into the strange, the forgotten, and the beautifully unsettling. Stay curious and keep walking.